Hey guys, TheJordude's here, back again with another Shadowverse video. This video is sponsored by Cygames. If you want to play Shadowverse, you can do so for free on your mobile devices on the Android or the Apple app stores, as well as on your PC through Steam. If you want to do so, I'll have the link down below in the description. And if you play a lot of Shadowverse and you want to try to get competitive, try to get your name out there, there's going to be some big tournaments coming up, such as the NGE Season 3 and the Shadowverse Grand Prix. More details of that are to come, so stay tuned. So in my previous video, I talked about the levels of strategy you want to think about when preparing for a tournament, and that was your step 1 on your preparation, and that's going to build your overall foundation on how you're going to prepare for the tournament. Now, in this video, I'm going to be talking about the types of decks. So, in levels of strategy, I said you want to think of your 3 decks as one, and so you can look at a broad perspective, a broad overall strategy. But in this video, I'm focusing more on your decks individually. So when I talk about types of decks, I'm talking about like the overall like play style of the deck. So in Shadowverse, there's generally like 4 types of decks you could play, and that is aggro, mid-range, control, and combo. So when you're building a lineup, you have to of course have 3 decks, but you could make it so that your lineup is fully aggro decks, fully mid-range, fully control, fully combo. But you can also mix it up. You can also have like aggro, mid-range, a combo deck, or like 2 aggro, a mid-range, or like 2 mid-range, a control, etc, etc. So how this relates to the levels of strategy is that while they do seem similar, levels of strategy, you're looking at how your decks fit together and synergize against other strategies. Whereas types of decks, you have to combine your types of decks appropriately, because if you just have like a random mix of deck types, then you're just going to have like an N4 strategy, but N4 level of strategy. But if you tie them together, maybe then that's how you build into your N1, your N2, N3 strategy, right? So like maybe aggro sword, aggro blood, and mid-range shadow is an N1 strategy lineup. There's like a couple of ways you can mix it up, as long as that they go together well with your overall level of strategy, your overall ban strategy. Ban strategy is another video I'm going to be talking about later on. Then that's mainly what you're trying to focus on, and how I'm going to try to help you choose what types of decks, what kind of playstyle you want to play when preparing for the tournament. So let's get into like the types of decks first of all, and like the pros and cons of each type of deck playstyle. So for aggro, you have something like ambush sword or aggro blood, and then I also have here aggro dirt. So these decks are very what they try to do is try to kill your opponent as fast as possible. That's why they're called aggro. They're aggressive. You try to get the board early on, try to kill them by like turn 6. The pros about it is that if you get the initiative, if you get the early board and your opponent doesn't really have good answers to it, you could get a lot of chip damage in, finish them off either through your board damage, or maybe you have some additional direct burn in your hand. So it's very good at fast games, punishing your opponent for not having the answers. You force them to have answers. The cons about aggro decks is that generally they do run out of steam quickly. So because all the cards are generally low cost, you play a lot in your early mid game, and then if your opponent has answers to them and can remove your threats efficiently, then you start to run out of steam. And then if you can't get enough damage in early game, it's going to be hard for you to finish the game off, just because your opponent's always going to be outvaluing you and you won't be able to get the chance to get damage in. So those are like the pros and cons of aggro decks. The next type of deck, mid-range, I kind of lumped them later on together, but mid-range generally it's kind of more of a linear strategy. You have early game, mid game, and kind of like a top end that's heavier than aggro. It's similar to aggro in the fact that you do have the early game, you try to get the early game board, but you have better mid-game presence. So in mid-shadow you have like Death's Breath, so they have better ways of getting the board mid-game. And then if they do get that mid-game advantage on the board, they just snowball that into victories. Mid-range decks could also be very aggressive, especially against slower decks that don't have answers early on. If a mid-range deck builds the board, they could end the game quite quickly as well, just like aggro can. And as you can see here, I have like neutral decks I consider mid-range because they're very follower heavy and they're kind of more in the mid-game curve. And then of course mid shadow. So yeah, those were the pros. Is that they're like aggro, they could get the board early, and then except they could snowball in the mid and transition towards the late game. They have more value than aggro decks. The cons for mid-range decks is that they're very, like I said, they are very linear. They just try to get the board and snowball off their board. But if your opponent can efficiently remove threats, keep contesting, maybe have a really good board AoE, then mid-range starts to fall behind late game if they can't build anything. Because like aggro, they do start to run out of steam. They do have more top end stuff. However, if your opponent can consistently remove threats, they'll eventually run out of cards to play. Control decks, so like control blood, they are looking to just be able to take it to the late game because they have a lot of big late game threats. They have win conditions in the late game, and the rest of the deck is built on getting to that point and sustaining. So like as you can see for Bloodcraft, the pros is that they have really good stuff to sustain. They have AoE, so Blood has Revelation. It also has Diabolic Drain, which is really good. Emeralda, Vampiric, Temptress, Vampire, Scarlet Saber. They got a lot of removal, so that's really good against aggro decks. And then if you could keep removing the aggro or mid-range threats in the early mid game, late game you play stuff like Bahamut. They can't really do anything about it. So those are the pros. The cons for control decks is that sometimes they could be a little inconsistent depending on your build. A lot of times you find that you have to have an exact card in exact situations. So maybe if you're playing like AES Control Haven, you have to have like a Themis Decree at some point against like a mid-range deck. If you don't have it, you get punished a lot and you just take too much damage and you eventually die. So that could be control, like especially because control has a lot more expensive cards in your deck. If you just draw like your top end cards and not your early game removals, you're just going to die and you can't really do anything about it, so you're sad. The last type of deck, combo. So combo, they basically just try to set up their big combo, which is their win condition against most matchups. So like OTK Roach, D-Shift, Rune, and Ramp Dragon with the combo in it. So the pros about combo decks are that they're very good at dealing with slower decks. So even like sometimes mid-range could be very slow if they don't curve out really well in the early mid-game, as well as the decks I showed you earlier, the control decks. The combo decks punishes the slow play because once you assemble the combo, your opponent really can't answer it or react to it because it's often OTK. The weaknesses about combo decks are that they are very fragile at times, especially when they're trying to build up their combo. They can't really deal with early aggression. So like if a neutral deck has a really aggressive opening curve, or an aggro deck of course should have like really good openings, aggro combo decks could take too much damage early on and then they just die before they can set up the combo, because the combo takes a long time. It usually takes them to like turn 7 to turn 8 to have like, that's when they have like really good hands where they could start getting their combo off. So by that time they could already be dead by aggro and mid-range decks. So one thing I want to mention when I'm defining the types of decks is that there's also kind of like a rock paper scissors thing. So when you're trying to put your decks together in a lineup, you want to consider that aggro and mid-range decks are typically good against combo decks. Control decks are usually good against aggro mid-range, though sometimes aggro could just be too good where control can't deal with it anyways. But generally control is like good against mid-range for sure, aggro most of the time, and then combo is good against control decks. So that's kind of like your rock paper scissors meta, where you need to consider. So like if you want to build your lineup so that you have like an 3 aggro lineup, you have to consider that maybe mid-range or control might be a thing where it will counter your 3 decks completely. Or maybe if you're playing like a triple control lineup, you have to consider that guy that's just going to bring like D-Shift and OTK Roach and then just counter you. Usually when you put together a lineup, I don't recommend you go for a triple aggro, triple mid-range, triple control, triple combo lineup, just because of the rock, paper, scissors meta. There's a lot of variety of lineups, so you don't want to run a triple lineup of the same type and run into someone that just has the rock to your scissors, kind of, so to speak. So when you're building your lineup, when you think about the types of decks you want to build into your levels of strategy, you do want to mix it up. You don't want to have, like I said, you don't want to have like triple aggro. You might want to have like a double aggro and then maybe like a combo. Although because there is a ban, so there is going to be a ban strategy. Is if you go double aggro and a combo, that person might just be playing mid-range decks and then just ban your combo deck. So generally you do want to have quite a mix of decks. So maybe you want to play like aggro sword, an aggro deck, a mid-range deck, and then like a combo deck. That way you can't really get polarized into your opponent's ban strategy. That's one way of thinking about it, but you could also do the other way where you build your lineups, your level of strategies, and then you have your 3 decks that target something specifically. So maybe you want to be that person, maybe you want to be that rock to that person's scissors. Maybe you want to play like 3 aggro decks because it targets mid-range neutral decks very well. Then that's another way you could strategize and prepare for tournaments. So that's pretty much it for this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure you give it a thumbs up and subscribe. If you have any questions, the comment boxes are down below in the description. Check me out on my social media links down below as well. I have my Twitch and Twitter in there. And thanks for watching, guys. See you guys next time. Peace. I saw